What I need to do next is I need to install the cylinder head. But first I'll have to put the head gasket on. Now here's the old gasket, and it's totally not reusable. This is a graphite steel head gasket, and I do not recommend using these ones. They don't last long. They tend to have leaks in them, and they leave so much residue on the mating surface. So you don't want to be using this one. But I kept this one so I could measure the thickness of the gasket. 0.51 of millimeters. So this is a 0.5 millimeter gasket. Now I need to seek a gasket that's in this range. Now here's the thing. Because this is a 29 millimeters stroke, it's 29 cc engine, and it's not 30.5, I believe I still have some room for a thinner gasket. Now the gain that I'm going to get from a thinner gasket is higher compression and in return higher power. So I get myself this brand new Cooper gasket. Here's a brand new Cooper gasket, and the thickness of this one is, that's 0.3 of millimeters. So this gasket is considerably thinner than the previous gasket, and I should be gaining more power. But at the same time, I will have to be very careful, and I will have to measure the squish clearance, which is the clearance between the piston and the compression dome or the head, and make sure that the piston is not hitting the head. Usually on the head gasket, this excess part here, this one, goes to the exhaust side. And here I'm just eyeballing the gasket, making sure that it's not covering any of the transfer ports path, because I previously have come across lower quality gaskets, and they were covering the path of the transfer ports. So here with this one I can see that the transfer port is all clear. And I'm not going to install any RTV or silicone sealant around the gasket. I'll just let the gasket do its job. Now, before installing the cylinder head, it's very important to lubricate the inner walls, so that when the piston goes in, it goes to lubricated surfaces. So I'll just spread the oil with my finger all over the cylinder walls. And I'm going to lubricate the piston a little bit, especially around the piston ring. Now always make sure that you are installing the cylinder head in the correct orientation. Now here's the piston ring, and I'll squeeze the ring around the inner pin, so I'll make enough path for it to go inside the cylinder. And I'm going to grab the cylinder at the same time as I'm squeezing the ring and push it in, and like so. Now that the head has caught its path with the piston, with the cylinder head screws, I prefer to have the thread lock inside the threads itself. It's getting difficult to have it with the screws. I'll add one drop of thread lock in each hole to make sure that whenever the screws goes in, they find something to lock them up. Now, as usual, clean screws, and I'm going in crisscross pattern. And the cylinder head screws are 4mm hex drive or Allen key. Depends on where you are from. Now that all the 4 screws are seated, I'm going to give them a snug. And now I'll crank. And this seems good. It's cranking, and it does not seem to be touching anything. So I can carry on with the installation. I'll be measuring the squish clearance later on, and I'll show you one method that works for me. But for now, I know I can continue with the installation. So now I'm going to torque the cylinder head screws. Now the torque spec for the cylinder head screws is between 70 to 80 kilograms per centimeter. First, I'm going to work my way and torque them at 45 kilograms per centimeter, and then I'll gradually go to 70. Okay, so that was 45. And this is 70. Now I'll crank the engine again just to feel that there are no contacts. And this seems fantastic. So next, I'll have flywheel on, I'll have clutch on. I'm going to plug the piston stopper in so I can install and mount the flywheel and the clutch. But to install the clutch first, I'll need the clutch holder. First, I'm going to install the key, the Woodruff key or the flywheel key on the crank, like so. It's a small half moon shaped piece. And now on the flywheel you can see that there is a groove and the Woodruff key should slide inside this groove, like so. The size of the nut is 12 mm. I'll drive it in with the nut socket. And honestly, I did not find any torque spec for this particular nut, so I'm going to tie it by feel. And I know where I should stop. And that's enough. Now next, I'll be installing the clutch holder. Now this is the clutch holder that was on the engine previously. I don't feel like installing this one again. Instead, I will be installing this clutch holder, which is lighter weight and it's easier to deal with. The screw of the clutch holder is 4 mm and this one goes with no thread lock. You do not need any thread lock or Loctite on this one. And also I'm torquing by feel. And this is enough. Now next, I'm going to be installing the clutch. Now here's the clutch that was on the engine. It's not completely worn out yet. It can be used, but it's missing a piece here. There is a piece of that clutch is gone. So I will not be using this clutch again. And instead, I'll be installing a brand new clutch. Here's the clutch screw, and the clutch has inner washers and outer washers. There are washers to be placed here before the clutch is seated, and there are washers to be placed between the screw top and the clutch itself. So I'm placing the washers, the inner washers, putting them in place, and then I'll put the clutch on them. And then I'll get the screws in one by one, and I'll tie them by hand. Now that the clutch is installed and the flywheel is installed, I can remove the piston lock. Now, before I go any further with this rebuild, I'm going to take the measurement of the squish clearance. The squish clearance basically is the distance between the cylinder head and the top of the piston when the piston is at its top level, which is called also top dead center. In order to do that, I'm going to use this solder iron wire. Now, the solder iron is very soft metal, so it's not going to harm the cylinder or the piston. And I'll place it inside like so, and then I'm going to give it few taps with the piston. And that's what I'm going to get. The piston will flatten the solder iron a bit, and then I can come with my caliper and measure exactly the thickness of the solder iron. I'm reading 0.42 mm, which is excellent because the ideal squish clearance should be anywhere between 0.35 to 0.5 mm. Any more than 0.5, then you will have gutless compression, your engine will be weak, and any lower than 0.35, your engine will run very hot, and there's good chance that this will make future problems. For the sake of good measure, I'll do this again, and I'll take the reading again. This time is reading 0.45, and that's good. So everything is within the spec. The squish clearance is within the spec. I know this now. Perhaps this is not the most scientific way to measure the squish clearance, but it's a way that it works for me. Here's the old spark plug. It's dirty, so I'm not going to put it back in. Instead, I'm going to install a brand new spark plug to go in this engine. Now next, I will be installing the ignition coil. But here's the thing, it's extremely difficult to place the ignition coil here because the flywheel has magnets and they instantly catch in the ignition coil, as you can see. And if you place it too far, the magnets are not going to interfere with the coils and it will not make a spark, or the spark will be very weak to start the engine. So to overcome this issue, I'm going to use the business card trick. I'll place a business card here, like so, and then I'll let the magnet seat the ignition coil completely. Now, before going any further, I'll have Loctite on the screws for the ignition coil. And the ignition coil screws are 3 mm hex. And I'm having the screws snug. Now the torque spec for these two screws, the ignition coil screws, is anywhere from 30 to 40 kilometers per centimeter. Okay, I'll go at 40. Actually 40 seems a little bit too much. Okay, let me tie the other one. Yeah, 40 is a lot. Now that I tied them so much trying to achieve 40, I have reset at 30, and let me see how's the torque. Here's 30. After torquing the screws, simply remove the business card. Now you can see there is a good clearance between the flywheel and the ignition coil. And the flywheel is not touching the ignition coil at all. And we are nearly done. Next, I'll install the engine covers. And I'll slide this rubber grommet in the plastic cover, like so. Now, an easier way to work around this is to slide the stop switch or the kill switch in the cover before putting it on the engine, like so. The fan cover screws are also 4 mm. Yeah, hex drive. They are not Phillips 4 mm, they are hex drive. Have it snug, and then next one. Now, when I took the engine apart, there was a broken piece from the crankcase. I'll just put it in. I'll just keep it in its place, and there is a screw that's holding this piece in its place. Now, all of these screws, they go with no Loctite, but there is torque spec for them, and I'll tell you this in a minute. Now, before I go any further, just to make sure that the covers are seated, everything looks nice. Next, I'll install the screws connecting both covers together. Next, I'll install the screws holding both covers together, the flywheel cover and the engine cover. These are the only Phillips screws on this engine. There are no other Phillips screws than these two. And tie them up by hand. The torque spec for the flywheel cover is anywhere between 30 to 40 kilograms per centimeter. So I set my torque range at 35. Yeah, the thread of the screw is bad. So it's starting to slip, so I'm not going to torque it. Instead, I'm going to tie up the spark plug, and this should be enough. Now, on this cover, usually there is a third screw here, but I always ignore that. In my opinion, it's just unnecessary. Now, next, I'm going to install the isolator block, or the intake manifold. And as I did earlier, I'll lubricate the surface so that the gasket does not get stuck on it in the future. And I'll give the screws here a little bit of Loctite. The torque spec for these screws is anywhere between 30 to 40 kilograms per centimeter, so I will torque them at 35. Now, after that, I'll be installing the carburetor and the velocity intake. Now, I have placed a gasket here, and that's just a dust protector, so that no dust will come between the filter and the carburetor. Now, when installing the carburetor, the venturi side goes towards the air filter. And how do you know the venturi side? It's the bigger hole in the carburetor. As you can see that this hole is significantly bigger than that one. So the bigger hole, or the venturi side, or the venturi, goes towards the air filter. And then I'll put a brand new gasket on the setup before I go. And at last, a little bit of Loctite on these screws. Also snug, and then I'll tie it a little bit. And that's about it. And then a little bit for this one, and that's about it. And now the last thing I'm going to do, so the engine is ready to run, is install the air filter. And here is my particular air filter. I have given this air filter a good wash before I reinstall it. Not just the air filter, I washed the base of the filter and the clamps as well, and I washed this outer wear. I'm going to tie the clamp. And tie the other clamp. Now I'll have the outer wear installed in. I can leave the filter like that with no outer wear, but the outer wear forms as excellent protection against dust, so I like to use them. And especially if you are running this engine off the road in an off-road RC car, you definitely need some of these because you don't want the sand to go inside your engine. And like so. So this engine is expected to perform as a new engine. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you like it, give it a thumbs up. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, be safe, and do it yourself.